They called their union a merger of blood, a sacred vow to keep the streets of Seoul quiet. But as Jang Min-seok stood at the altar, his neck tattoos hidden by a silk collar and his heart locked behind a mask of cold duty, he didn't realize the quiet was about to shatter. He was seconds away from marrying a woman he'd never spoken to, all to please a father who had already stolen his soul. But then, the cathedral doors didn't just open. They groaned under the weight of a secret the Jang family thought they had buried in the dirt months ago. Standing in the aisle, framed by the late afternoon sun, was Arielle Mensah. She wasn't wearing white, and she wasn't there to beg. Clad in a simple gray dress that couldn't hide the life growing inside her, she leveled a finger at the most feared man in the underworld. Her voice didn't shake. It cut through the incense and the lies like a blade. "Tell them, Min-seok," she cried out, her eyes burning with a fire that made the Mafia's guns look like toys. "Tell them who the father of this child is before you give that woman your name. Arielle is standing alone against an empire of shadows to protect the legacy they tried to erase. If you believe a mother's love is more powerful than any cartel, comment legacy below. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell. You won't want to miss the moment the dragon of Seoul finally chooses his side." The air in the cathedral turned to ice. For the guests, the kings and monsters of the criminal world, this was a scandal. For the bride, it was a humiliation. But for Min-seok, looking down the long aisle at the woman he had been told was gone forever, it was a resurrection. He remembered the summer of salt and silk. The way Arielle's laughter had been the only thing that could drown out the dark demands of his father. He had let her go to save her life, or so he thought. Now, seeing the curve of her belly and the fierce determination in her gaze, he realized the elders hadn't just separated them. They had declared war on his blood. The priest froze, the pax mafiosa crumbled, and as Min-seok took his first step away from the altar and toward the woman in gray, the underworld realized they hadn't invited a victim to this wedding. They had invited the only person capable of bringing the Jang Empire to its knees. Rain in Seoul didn't fall. It descended like a heavy curtain of gray silk, blurring the neon lights of the Gangnam district into a watercolor dream. It was under this deluge, in the quiet, dust-scented corners of the university's architecture library, that Arielle first felt the pull of a world she didn't belong to. She was hunched over a blueprint of the Gyeongbokgung Palace, her fingers traced in charcoal, trying to reconcile ancient Korean aesthetics with modern structural integrity. The cantilever on the eastern wing is traditionally unsupported. A low, melodic voice remarked from the shadows of the stacks. "If you reinforce it with steel, you lose the soul of the wood." Arielle looked up, expecting a fellow student or a weary professor. Instead, she found a man who looked like he had been carved from the very obsidian he spoke of. Min-seok stood there, his presence far too large for the cramped aisle. Even then, before she knew the weight of his name, there was an air of dangerous quiet about him. He wasn't wearing the tailored suits of a mob boss yet. He was in a simple black sweater, though the edge of a dark tattoo peeked out from beneath his collar, a hint of the ink that marked his skin like a map of sins. They shouldn't have spoken. She was a daughter of Ghana, a brilliant mind seeking to build skyscrapers in a land that still looked at her with polite curiosity. He was the heir to an empire built on shadows and silence. But as they argued over the philosophy of space and the permanence of stone, the boundaries of race, class, and the looming threat of his heritage simply evaporated. For 3 hours, the world outside, the bodyguards waiting in black sedans, the expectations of his father, the lonely struggle of an international student, didn't exist. There was only the scratch of pencils and the electric hum of an intellectual spark that felt like a homecoming. Min-seok looked at her sketches not as a critic, but as a man seeing color for the first time. "You see the bones of the city," he whispered, his hand hovering near hers over the parchment. "Most people only see the skin." At that moment, Arielle didn't see the death god of Seoul. She saw a man who felt trapped by the very walls he was born to inherit. It was an accidental intimacy, a bridge built of paper and ink. As the library lights flickered, signaling the end of the night, Min-seok promised to meet her again. It was a secret they began to build together, brick by careful brick, unaware that the foundation was already resting on a fault line that his family was ready to ignite. The secret they had built brick by brick didn't crumble. It was detonated. The fault line finally shifted on a Tuesday, a night when the humidity in Seoul felt like a physical weight against Arielle's skin. She was in her small studio apartment, the walls covered in sketches of arches and bridges, when the knock came. It wasn't the rhythmic, gentle tap Min-seok used. It was a heavy, rhythmic thud that sounded like a gavel. When she opened the door, Min-seok wasn't there. Instead, 3 men in identical charcoal suits stood like monoliths against the hallway's flickering fluorescent light. The man in the center, an elder with eyes as sharp and cold as shattered glass, didn't step inside. He didn't need to. His presence turned her sanctuary into a cage. He held out a single manila envelope. Inside were photos of her, walking to class, buying coffee, and laughing in the library with Min-seok. "You are a distraction he cannot afford," the elder said, his voice a raspy whisper that carried the authority of 1,000 years of blood debt. "Min-seok is the future of the Jang Syndicate. You are a footnote that will be erased. If you stay, his father will not just strip him of his inheritance. He will ensure the accident that claims your life is slow enough for him to watch." The threat was clinical, devoid of heat, which made it all the more terrifying. Arielle felt the air leave her lungs. She looked past them, hopping to see a black sedan, hopping to see Min-seok coming to break the line. But she knew the architecture of his world better than anyone. If he came for her now, he would be walking into a trap set by his own blood. She had to make a choice. Remain and become the reason for his downfall, or vanish and become the ghost that saved him. "I have a plane ticket in my hand," the elder continued, holding out a slip of paper that felt like a death warrant. "And my men are downstairs to help you pack. You have 20 minutes to become a memory." With trembling hands, Arielle grabbed a single backpack. She left the blueprints. She left the half-finished coffee. She even left the silver ring Min-seok had given her, placing it on the center of her drafting table where the light would hit it first. As she was ushered into the back of a cold, leather-scented car, she caught her reflection in the glass. She looked like a stranger. As the car sped toward Incheon Airport, she pressed her hand against her stomach, a gesture she didn't yet fully understand. She watched the lights of Seoul retreat, her heart splintering with every mile. She was disappearing into the night, not out of fear for her own life, but to preserve his. She was the architect, and tonight she had designed the most painful structure of all, a life without him. Arielle made the ultimate sacrifice to keep Min-seok safe, but did she underestimate the man she left behind? Would you leave everything to save the person you love, or would you stay and fight the shadows together? Tell us your thoughts in the comments below. Next, we see the consequences of a throne built on a lie. In the months following the vanishing, Min-seok became a ghost inhabiting a throne of glass. The man who had once debated the soul of architecture was gone, replaced by a sovereign of ice. He moved through the gilded halls of the Jang estate with a precision that terrified even his high-ranking lieutenants. He did exactly what was expected of him. He stabilized the shipping routes, he silenced the dissenters, and he accepted the strategic marriage to the daughter of the rival clan. But his eyes, once bright with the fire of discovery, were now flat and hollow. He wore his power like a crown of thorns, each successful merger and each expanded territory only digging deeper into his skin. He was the perfect puppet king, a man who ruled an empire but didn't own a single second of his own life. Every night, he returned to his private quarters and stared at the silver ring he had found on a drafting table. It was the only evidence that he hadn't hallucinated the woman who taught him how to breathe. He believed his father's lies, that Arielle had taken the money and fled back to a life that didn't include a monster's son. He allowed the bitterness to settle in his marrow, using it as fuel to become the ruthless leader the Syndicate required. He was a man waiting for the end of the world, preparing to say, "I do," to a woman he didn't know, in a cathedral that felt more like a tomb. Thousands of miles away, in a quiet coastal town where the air tasted of salt instead of Seoul's smog, Arielle was building a different kind of life. She lived in a small, sun-drenched room, working remotely on architectural renderings for firms that didn't care about her face or her history. She had spent weeks in a state of mourning, her body feeling heavy and foreign, until the morning the world tilted on its axis. It wasn't just the morning sickness that alerted her. It was the way her body began to protect itself, a deep, instinctual shift that signaled she was no longer alone. Standing in a cramped bathroom with a plastic stick in her hand, she watched the two pink lines emerge like a silent bridge between her past and a terrifying future. She wasn't just carrying a memory anymore, she was carrying the Jang legacy. She sat on the edge of her bed, her hand resting over her still flat stomach, and felt a surge of fierce, protective heat. The elders had tried to erase her, and Min-seok was currently being crowned in thorns. But here, in the quiet, a new architecture was rising. She looked at the televised announcement of the upcoming wedding on her laptop, the screen showing Min-seok's cold, handsome face. He looked like a king, but she knew he was a prisoner. And for the first time since she fled, Arielle didn't feel like a victim. She felt like a mother with a secret that could burn a kingdom to the ground. The blue light of the laptop screen was the only thing illuminating Arielle's darkened room, casting long, lonely shadows against the walls. On the screen, a news ticker scrolled relentlessly across a live broadcast from Seoul. The headline was gold-plated and heartless. The union of the century, Jang and Choi families to merge in historic cathedral ceremony. Arielle sat motionless, the cool salt air from the open window stinging her skin. There was Min-seok. He stood on a podium, flanked by men in suits who looked more like vultures than guardians. Beside him stood a woman draped in diamonds, her smile as polished and vacant as a porcelain doll. Min-seok's face, however, was a fortress of stone. He looked directly into the camera, and for a split second, Arielle's breath hitched. She looked for a flicker of the man who had whispered about the soul of wood in the university library, but all she saw was a stranger wearing a crown of cold duty. The announcer's voice gushed about the purity of the lineage and the unbroken future of the Jang dynasty. Each word felt like a deliberate strike against the life growing inside Arielle. By standing at that altar, Min-seok wasn't just marrying a stranger, he was participating in a televised lie. He was agreeing to a world where their child, the child of a woman they had called a never-exist. To the world, this was a fairy tale of power. To Arielle, it was a funeral for the truth. She looked down at her hands, which were resting protectively over her stomach. In that moment, the grief that had anchored her for months began to evaporate, replaced by a cold, architectural clarity. She realized that the elders hadn't just stolen her life, they were attempting to steal her child's right to a name. They were building a future on a foundation of her silence, and she knew better than anyone that a structure built on a lie could never stand. "They think you're a ghost," she whispered into the quiet room, her voice finally finding its edge. "They think we don't count." She watched as Min-seok's father placed a hand on his son's shoulder, a gesture of ownership, not affection. Arielle didn't see a wedding anymore, she saw a crime scene. She stood up, her silhouette sharp against the moonlight. She wouldn't let her child be a footnote in a Mafia ledger. If the world was going to watch the wedding of the century, she would make sure they saw the one thing the Jang family couldn't buy, the truth. She reached for her passport, the paper crinkling in her grip. The vanishing was over. It was time to return to the city of glass and shadows, not as a victim, but as a reckoning. Returning to Seoul felt like stepping back into a blueprint she had once tried to perfect, only to find the lines blurred by smog and secrets. Arielle moved through Incheon International Airport not as the terrified girl who had fled in the night, but as a ghost returning to haunt the living. She didn't head for the main gates where the black sedans of the Jang Syndicate sat like predatory sharks. Instead, she took the subway. Blending into the sea of commuters, her dark gray dress and oversized coat shielding the truth of her silhouette. The Myeongdong Cathedral sat atop its hill like a fortress of stone and stained glass, surrounded by a perimeter of men who wore their violence in the set of their jaws and the bulge of holsters beneath their jackets. The security was absolute, designed to stop a rival clan's motorcade or a coordinated hit. They were looking for threats that arrived with the roar of engines and the flash of steel. They were not looking for a woman walking alone with a bouquet of lilies and a map of the cathedral's service tunnels etched into her memory. Arielle bypassed the main checkpoint, moving instead toward the rear delivery entrance where the caterers and florists were frantically unloading the last of the white roses. She didn't try to sneak past. She simply walked with the exhaustion of a worker who had been on her feet for 10 hours. When a guard stepped into her path, his hand resting on his radio, she didn't flinch. She looked him in the eye, her face a mask of weary professionalism, and spoke in the flawless, formal Korean she had practiced with Min-seok in the library. "The bride's veil was snagged during the rehearsal," she said, her voice steady. "The designer sent me the replacement. If the ceremony starts and she's still in the back with a torn train, do you want to be the one who tells the chairman why?" The guard hesitated, his eyes flickering over her. In his world, women were either decorative or invisible. He saw her pregnant belly and instinctively softened his stance, a rare flicker of humanity in a man paid to be a monster. He saw a woman in distress, not a weapon. He stepped aside, gesturing to her through the service door. As the heavy oak door clicked shut behind her, Arielle leaned against the cold stone wall, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She was inside. The incense and the sound of the pipe organ filtered through the vents, a funeral march for her past. She straightened her dress, smoothed her hair, and began the long walk toward the nave. The gates had been crashed, not with force, but with the quiet, devastating power of a mother who had nothing left to lose. The air inside the cathedral was thick with the scent of lilies and expensive incense, a heavy, cloying perfume that felt like a shroud. Min-seok stood at the altar, a monolith in black, his hand hovering inches from the delicate, lace-covered fingers of the woman he was supposed to bind his life to. The priest's voice droned on, a rhythmic murmur of tradition and duty, until the heavy oak doors at the back of the nave didn't just open, they struck the stone walls with the force of an explosion. The silence that followed was absolute, a vacuum that sucked the breath from the lungs of every guest. Arielle stepped into the light, her dark gray dress a defiant stain against the sea of white and gold. She didn't look like a victim, she looked like a reckoning. Her eyes were fixed on Min-seok, ignoring the gasps and the frantic rustle of silk as the elite of Seoul's underworld turned to stare. "Min-seok," her voice rang out, vibrating against the high, vaulted ceilings. It wasn't a plea, it was a command that pulled him back from the dead. Min-seok froze. The mask of the puppet king didn't just crack, it shattered. He turned slowly, his eyes wide and haunted as they raked over the woman he thought had abandoned him for a price. But as his gaze traveled down to the curve of her belly, the world outside that cathedral ceased to exist. The rival bride let out a sharp, choked sob, her veil trembling as she looked from the pregnant stranger to the man she was supposed to marry. "Tell them," Arielle cried, her finger leveled at him like a loaded weapon. "Tell them who the father of this child is before you give that woman your name." The chairman, Min-seok's father, rose from the front pew, his face a mask of purple rage. "Security, remove this woman," he roared, his voice echoing with the authority of a man who had never been questioned. But as the guards moved forward, their hands reaching for the holsters concealed beneath their jackets, Min-seok took a step, then another. He moved with a predatory grace, stepping off the altar and positioning himself directly between Arielle and the men who were paid to erase her. The visual was visceral, the tall, tattooed heir of the Jang Empire, standing in the middle of the aisle, shielding a black woman whose only armor was her truth. "If any of you lay a hand on her," Min-seok whispered, his voice low and carrying a promise of violence that turned the guards to stone, "you will never leave this cathedral alive." In that moment, the merger of blood died. The bride was a ghost, the elders were powerless, and the architecture of the Jang Empire was being redrawn in the middle of the aisle. The war wasn't coming, it was already here. The heavy silence of the cathedral was replaced by the frantic, metallic clicking of dozens of safety catches being released. In the pews, the elite of the underworld, men who had ordered executions over dinner, watched with predatory hunger as the wedding of the century dissolved into a bloodbath in waiting. The chairman stood at the front, his face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated loathing. He didn't see a woman or a grandchild. He saw a glitch in his machinery, a stain on the Jang legacy that needed to be scrubbed away. "Min-seok, step away from her," the chairman commanded, his voice trembling with a lethal edge. "You are a Jang. You do not sacrifice a kingdom for a mistake." But Min-seok didn't step away. He did the one thing no one in that room expected. He reached back and took Arielle's hand, his fingers locking with hers in a grip that was as much a vow as any prayer. He felt her trembling, but when he looked into her eyes, he didn't see the fear of a victim. He saw the fire of the woman who had once challenged him to build things that lasted. "She isn't a mistake," Min-seok said, his voice echoing through the vaulted stone halls with a terrifying, calm clarity. "She is the only truth I have ever owned. And this child is the only heir the Jang family will ever have." A roar of outrage erupted from the left side of the aisle. The father of the jilted bride, a man whose power rivaled the chairman's, stepped forward, his eyes fixed on Arielle with murderous intent. "You insult my blood for this, for a ghost who crawled out of the shadows," he signaled to his own men, his voice rising to a scream. "If the Jang family won't clean their own house, I will. I want her blood on the altar." As the rival clan's guards surged forward, Min-seok didn't reach for a weapon. He used his body as a shield, spinning Arielle behind him and pressing her back against a cold marble pillar. He stood like a dark god of protection, his tall frame obscuring her completely from the sights of the gunmen. His neck tattoos seemed to pulse against his skin as he bared his teeth at the room. "Touch her," Min-seok whispered, a sound that carried further than any shout, "and I will burn this city until there isn't a stone left standing to mark your names." The visual was haunting. The Mafia heir in his bespoke wedding suit, standing in a sanctuary of God, ready to commit a massacre for a woman the world told him to forget. For the first time in his life, Min-seok wasn't a puppet. He was a man who had finally found something worth more than a throne. Min-seok has chosen his side, but the cathedral is surrounded, and the chairman's wrath knows no bounds. Would you stand your ground when the whole world is pointing a gun at you? Tell us in the comments what you would do for love. Next, the dragon makes his move to get his queen to safety. The roar of the cathedral's organ was replaced by the screech of tires on ancient cobblestones as Min-seok's personal security detail cut a path through the chaos. He didn't wait for his father's permission or the rival clan's retaliation. With one arm anchored firmly around Arielle's waist, he moved through the glass-strewn foyer like a hurricane. He shielded her from the camera flashes of the paparazzi and the glinting barrels of the Syndicate guards, his own body acting as a human bulwark. They were spiraled away in a reinforced sedan that smelled of leather and gunpowder, the city of Seoul blurring into a streak of neon lights outside the tinted windows. Arielle sat in the backseat, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her hand still locked in Min-seok's. The silence between them was heavy, pregnant with the realization that they had just burned down the only world they knew. "Where are we going?" she whispered, her voice finally cracking under the weight of the adrenaline. "To a place they didn't build," Min-seok replied, his eyes scanning the rearview mirror for the headlights of his father's hunters. "A place they don't own." The sanctuary was a brutalist masterpiece of concrete and steel tucked into the rugged cliffs of Buckhanson. It was a fortress of his own design, separate from the Jang estate, fortified with the very technology he had once been scolded for studying. As the heavy blast doors hissed shut behind them, sealing them into a world of quiet security and soft amber light, the tension in Min-seok's shoulders didn't leave. It simply changed shape. He turned to Arielle, his suit jacket torn and his white boutonniere stained with the dust of the cathedral. For the first time, he let himself look at her, really look at her. He knelt before her, his large, tattooed hands trembling as they hovered near her belly. "My father will not stop," he said, his voice a low, guttural vow. "He doesn't see a child. He sees a threat to his bloodline's purity. To him, I am a traitor, and you are a witness that must be silenced." Arielle reached out, cupping his face, her thumb brushing over the ink on his neck. "And what are you to him now, Min-seok?" "I am the man who's going to take everything from him," he whispered. The realization was a cold, architectural truth. The chairman had spent 30 years building a legacy, but he had forgotten one thing. He had raised his son to be a master of structures. Min-seok knew every weakness, every load-bearing lie, and every cracked foundation of the Jang Empire. He wasn't just hiding her. He was preparing to demolish the house that had tried to bury them. The war for the heir had begun, and for the first time in history, the dragon wasn't fighting for the throne. He was fighting for the cradle. The following weeks were not characterized by the roar of gunfire, but by the cold, surgical precision of a master architect removing the load-bearing pillars of a condemned building. From the silence of the cliffside sanctuary, Min-seok didn't strike at his father's body. He struck at his shadow. He knew the Jang Syndicate wasn't just held together by fear, but by a complex lattice of offshore accounts, shipping manifests, and digital keys that he had designed himself under the guise of modernization. While Arielle rested, her presence a grounding force in the center of his storm, Min-seok worked with a terrifying focus. One by one, the elders who had stood in the cathedral and called for Arielle's blood found their worlds dissolving. It started with the accidental freezing of the Choi family's assets, the jilted bride's dowry vanishing into the ether of encrypted servers. Then, the shipping routes that provided the Syndicate's lifeblood were rerouted through shells and proxies that only Min-seok controlled. He was a ghost in the machine, a digital dragon burning the grain in the silos before the winter. He didn't just want them defeated, he wanted them to understand the exact moment they became obsolete. The chairman watched from his ivory tower as his loyalists began to defect, not out of love for Min-seok, but out of a primal fear of the man who could make $1 billion disappear with a keystroke. The elders who once whispered threats now found themselves locked out of their own counting houses, their purity and legacy worthless in the face of a man who had weaponized their own greed against them. Late one night, Min-seok stood before a wall of monitors, the blue light reflecting in eyes that had lost their hollow look. He had become a monster far more efficient than his father, a monster who fought with logic instead of just rage. But when Arielle walked into the room, her hand resting on the swell of her stomach, the ice in his veins thawed. "Is it done?" she asked softly. "The structure is compromised," Min-seok replied, turning toward her. "The elders are bankrupt, the rival clan has retreated to lick their wounds, and my father is sitting in a house that no longer belongs to him." He had restructured the underworld into a sanctuary for his child. He had proven that the most dangerous man isn't the one who loves power, but the one who is willing to destroy an empire to protect a single heartbeat. The crown of thorns had been cast aside, and in its place was a foundation of steel, built on the truth they had once tried to bury. The shadows that had once loomed over Seoul didn't vanish, but they were reshaped by a new sun. A year after the cathedral doors had groaned under the weight of a hidden truth, the city looked different through the glass walls of the Jang Min-seok architectural firm. It was a skyscraper of light and steel, built not on blood debt or intimidation, but on the very blueprints Arielle and Min-seok had once sketched in the dim silence of a university library. Min-seok sat in his office, the ink on his neck no longer a mark of a death god, but a testament to a man who had survived his own history. Beside him, Arielle stood with a confidence that radiated from her core, her eyes no longer searching for an exit. On her hip, she held their son, a boy with Min-seok's piercing gaze and Arielle's resilient spirit. He wasn't a secret or a distraction to be hidden in the margins of a ledger. He was the foundation of everything they had built. The chairman and the elders had been left in the ruins of their own making, trapped in a world of transactional loyalty that had finally gone bankrupt. They had discovered too late that you cannot own a man who has found something worth more than a throne. Min-seok hadn't just taken his father's empire, he had legitimized it, scrubbing the stains of the past to create a legacy his son would never have to apologize for. This journey from the shadows to the light serves as a profound reminder to us all. True power is never found in a title, a forced alliance, or the cold approval of a dynasty. It is found in the bone-deep courage to own your truth when the world demands your silence. It teaches us that identity is not a garment handed down by others, but a sanctuary we must claim for ourselves. In a world built on convenient lies and polished masks, the most dangerous and transformative thing you can be is honest. Arielle had arrived at a wedding with nothing but her voice and her child, and in doing so, she reminded the king that he was first a man. They proved that while an empire can be dismantled in a night, a family built on truth can survive an eternity. Min-seok traded a kingdom for a family, and in doing so, he became more powerful than his father ever dreamed. Would you burn down your world for the person you love, or is safety more important than the truth? Let us know in the comments. Like and share this story to support those who stand up to the giants. Thank you for listening. See you in the next one.